But anyway, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak before you today. I had a chance to pop into the one of the sessions, but I was there for the speakers earlier this morning. And aren't we lucky to work at and participate in institutions that will address these difficult issues? I mean, because so many times, especially today, our voices are being silenced out of fear. So I am very, very thankful to be here and thankful to hear from so many of you. So Dean Hine, and as she said, she's my dean, and I am just blessed to be able to work with her and to be supported in all of my work. I was honored to have her introduce me, and I have to say that I also have to just call out my chair, Dr. Cindy Lindquist, who is just amazing and supports me in everything I do. So we can give her a hand. Now, you've heard about what I do, but what I'd like to do right now is tell you a little bit about who I am. So, this is me, and this is a picture of me shortly after I turned 17 years old on a college campus called Cal State University, Chico. And I was just beginning to learn about me. I was away from home for the first time and living on campus and wearing my afro. My son keeps asking me to try to do my hair like that again, but it just won't work. But who am I? I'm an African American. I'm cisgender. I'm heterosexual. I'm a woman. I'm a Christian and a mother, and I'm also a wife. I am also the daughter of a disabled mother. And as I talk about who I am, I'm going to share how this plays out in my daily life. When I said a disabled mother, that was strange to me, because in those days, she was called crippled or handicapped. And it makes me just wonder about who decides what language to use, when it's deficit-based and when it changes, and when it does, who's served. But I share that I was a daughter of a disabled mother because having a disabled mother shaped me in the way I did things. My mother had no use of her right hand. So I learned to tie my shoes with one hand. I learned to braid my hair with one hand. I learned to do everything with just one hand because that's the way I was taught. But when I went to school, I found out that I was different. And it was really interesting as I think back on that because I was perceived as odd as my mother was because of the way I did things. And of course, through the shaming of our American school systems, I learned to do it the right way. And I had no idea that my mother was considered handicapped until she came to school one day and a little guy teased me saying, "You have a crippled mama, you have a crippled mama." So when I returned from suspension after hitting him, I talked to my mother and she said, "Well, why did you hit the little boy?" And I said, "Well, he called you crippled." And she looked at me with such an odd look and she said, "Baby, didn't you know?" And I had no idea that she was considered different. Years later, I became a single mom. And again, that curious language, because who determines single mom from unwed mothers? Some of you remember that term. Who determines whose child is legitimate or illegitimate? And when the language changed, why? And who did it serve? But as a single mother, when we talk about intersectionality and positionality, that put me in a different position. So here I was with this amazing miracle child that the doctor said I could never have, and being looked down upon because I was single, although her dad was very, very much a part of her life. And the struggles of being a single mom also put me in a different class, because now I was struggling, seriously struggling, although I came from an upper middle class family. And part of my struggle was choice, because I made the choice and I was determined not to ask my family for help, but still a struggle nonetheless. When this little precious girl turned 5 years old, we got married. And I always said we, because when I told her we were getting married and it was just the three of us with the priest, she had a fit. I thought we were getting married. Where are all the people? And she says she's never ever gotten over that. But here we are, we get married, and when you think about positionality, things changed again. So now I'm part of a middle class family. And when we look at family structures and what that means, so now my position changed again. What I wasn't prepared for, which was really odd to me, was being the wife of an African American male. And it was so interesting because I've walked in the shoes of an African American female, because that's who I am. And I assumed that my husband walked in those same shoes, perhaps, but it wasn't until we moved to Lone Tree, Colorado. Anybody here from Lone Tree or Highlands Ranch? Not a lot of people there who look like me. And we lived on a green belt, which means we had a split rail fence that was in the middle of the housing development. My son and my husband were playing ball. My husband hops over the fence to get the ball and hops back over to come into our yard, and within 10 minutes, 6 police officers are at our door because someone called the police saying a big black guy is breaking into the house. So they knock on the door and they tell us what happened, and then they ask to see my husband's driver's license, some ID. And I said, no, I'm sorry, excuse me, we're home. He doesn't have to show you his ID, we're at home. And my husband looked at me like I was crazy and said, just be quiet, which is unheard of for me to be quiet, but said, just be quiet, and I'm gonna go get my ID. And I said, you don't have to do that. And he said, I need you to be quiet. He said, officer, I'll go get my ID. And he came back with his ID and everything was okay, and he shut the door, and my 6'2", 275-pound husband was trembling. And he looked at me and said, were you trying to get me killed? And that was the first time I realized that my life was quite different than my husband's life. Even though we were both African American, I had no idea of the fear that he had to walk in when it came to interacting with police officers. A few years later, I gave birth to this little guy. And this is Clarence. This is our second miracle. This is the child that was never, ever to be born. And I look at him and I look at these pictures, and I don't know if you can see this, but he's holding a little red Lego. And this child had to have that Lego everywhere he went. And I do a lot of work around early childhood suspensions and the disproportionality around suspensions. And I don't know if you know that preschool children are suspended 3 times more than kindergarten through 12th grades combined. And those suspensions start before babies are walking, especially for African American males. So here he is, 9 months, and I think at 1 in the blue. So he's 4 times more likely to be suspended. But here's this little precious guy, prayed for little fella. He was my 9th pregnancy, and I only have 2 children. So this child was the hopes and dreams of our entire future. He was born when my husband was 45. And my husband is the baby of his family. So this was the last chance to even carry on the family name. So it was a really, really big deal. And I look at this guy now and I think, when they decide to suspend our babies, do they know what it took just for him to get here? Do they understand how precious he is, that he is an answered prayer? But anyway, when he turned 4, he was diagnosed with sensory integration processing disorder. So now I have an African American male who's been labeled with a disability who is now on an IEP. And that changed our lives. What I wasn't prepared for was as he got older, and here is when he was 12, he grew. He went from a short black kid to a very tall black kid, and he lost his childhood. This is the age where he began to be feared. And it broke my heart as a mother to know that this child, who literally would not kill ants, is now being feared by those same neighbors who called the police on my husband were now calling the police on him. So this is also a part of my identity in fearing for my son. And this is our family now. And our experiences shape, of course, who we are. And it has shaped my son into an amazing activist. And he and his sister are incredible activists. I said I was Christian. We go to a church that is full of activists. We pray and we cry and we mourn people who are oppressed, no matter where they are or who they are or what type of oppression. I'm there on the front lines with him all the time. But we know that we can't do this alone. We have to join forces with all oppressed people. It's simply who we are. And I'm going to read this to you because it was so powerful to me, and I hope it touches you. And this is a quote. As a 49-year-old black, lesbian, feminist, socialist mother of two, including a boy and a member of an interracial couple, I usually find myself part of some group defined as other, deviant, inferior, or just plain wrong. I find I am constantly being encouraged to pluck out some one aspect of myself and present this aspect as a meaningful whole, eclipsing or denying other parts of self. But this is a destructive and fragmenting way to live. My fullest concentration of energy is available to me only when I integrate all the parts of who I am, openly allowing power from particular sources of my living to flow back and forth freely through all my different selves without the restrictions of externally imposed definitions. Only then can I bring myself and my energies as a whole to the service of those struggles which I embrace as part of my living. And this is what intersectionality is. It is a phrase that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw about 30 years ago. And many of you have seen this intersectionality chart, and it goes over the categories of privilege as well as categories of oppression. But let's just look at them quickly. These are just some of the categories. Categories of privilege includes being white, being male, European, heterosexual, able-bodied, highly literate, gender-conforming, young, thin, light or pale, fertile, English-speaking, majority religion, attractive. Some of the categories of oppression include being non-fertile, old, unattractive. You know, I have to tell you something about being old. I was at a school yesterday, and you know, you never see yourself the way you're perceived. So this little guy walks up to me and he goes, hey, old lady. And I have to tell you, that's the first time in my life I was called an old lady. And it was so cute. And then I said, well, I'm really not that old. He goes, yes, you are with all that white in your hair. So being considered old and unattractive and illiterate, dark, gender deviant, poor, LGBTQIA, If your religion is not mainstream religion, a person of color, gender, non-European, overweight. These are just a few categories of oppression. Let's see how this could play out. Intersectionality is a way of thinking about identity and its relationship to power. So identity and power, and it brings visibility to group membership, all the groups that we're members of. Intersectionality is the theory of how different types of oppressions interact and impact people's lives. Another quote, "It's important to recognize that when one type of oppression is discussed, without acknowledging that there are also other oppressions that are connected, the dialogue often revolves around the experiences of the more privileged people in that group, whilst the issues and experiences of the more marginalized people can be overshadowed, dismissed, and erased." And I understand those of you who went to the whiteness workshop experienced a lot of that and talked about that today. I have to say that I was very, very pleased to hear that those conversations were very robust and they created a new way of thinking and seeing the world. So we know that an individual can face lots of threats of discrimination, especially when their identities overlap. And they can overlap in terms of race, gender, ethnicity, health. For instance, African American and queer. And their lives can be very different from those who are white and queer. And being Black and queer in a mixed race lesbian relationship can bring new types of power and interaction and intersectionality. A Hispanic man can face xenophobia even though he's born in this country, which in turn may be compounded by class issues and age issues. So you see how intersectionality connects every part of who we are. An immigrant woman can face sexism, racism, classism, and xenophobia. A Muslim woman can face sexism, racism, classism, xenophobia, and religious persecution. And we heard some of that today, just walking on campus and being spit on. Muslim men, the same thing. Racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, and you cannot dissect any parts of this and separate them out. Gay men, homophobia and classism, and Black men add racism as well. Black women may face sexism, racism, classism, and misogyny. White women can face sexism, classism, discrimination related to weight, and of course this can happen in any category to any groups of people. White men can face ageism, Black men ageism, and racism. Black women, ageism, racism, being discriminated against because of technological challenges, classism. White women, ageism, sexism, ableism. And what we rarely talk about is colorism. It's very seldom that we talk about in-group discrimination as well as out-group discrimination. Earlier, I talked to you about the privilege of being light or pale. And some of you may have wondered why I didn't just say white, because in many communities of color, the lighter you are as a member of that group, the more privilege you have. And that can be within the group, and it is certainly true in out groups. I want you to just take a look around and notice how many very dark-skinned African-American journalists, people in the media that you see. So the lighter you are, the more privilege you have. And we have to talk about this in order to really understand some of our students of color and what that means for them. Trans people face a multitude of forms of discrimination: anti-trans prejudice, sexism, and misogyny, and racism. And because of ignorance, they may also be faced with homophobia as well. And I found these slides that I just fell in love with. This one says, I knew my transition would not be easy, but it was a road worth taking. It has made me strong and resilient. I am proud to be Black and trans because I was created in God's likeness and for my design purpose. For me, personally and politically, there's no separating my womanness, my Blackness, my transness from my me-ness. I was on Facebook the other day, and one of my friends posted that he asked his daughter, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I loved her answer. I just want to be myself. I just want to be me. Because when it comes down to it, isn't that what we want? We just want to be who we are, without apologizing, without defending, without fearing. I just want to be me. I just want to be myself. I just want to be me. I just want to be myself. I just want to be me. I just want to be myself. That's me. I want to be me. But in order for me to be me, you have to see me. You have to take the blinders off. Colorblind ideology, now known as colorblind racism, when you see me, don't say things like, I don't see color. Rosemarie, I didn't even notice you were Black. Yeah, I've heard that one. Because if you don't notice I'm Black, then you don't see me. And if you don't see me, then you don't know the life that I live, the fears that I have, and my own uniqueness. You don't know that it took me to be well into my 50s before I would ever wear my hair like this. I worked for state government, you heard some of that, and I would never, ever in a million years wear my natural hair. My hair was straight because I was afraid to appear too ethnic. I was afraid if I didn't show up in a suit with straight hair that legislators wouldn't take me seriously. And even after I started wearing my hair natural without chemicals, it was still hard for me to not wear it pressed. You have no idea the fear that I have. I'm talking to higher ed right now. The fear that I have teaching some of my classes, knowing what's going on today, when I teach about whiteness or when I teach about privilege, being accused of being racist and telling people they have white privilege. I can talk about every category of privilege, but when someone's toe is stepped on, then as she called me white privilege. I called myself class privilege, I called myself heterosexual privilege, I called myself religious privilege, but that's not heard. There's a fear there, and if you don't see me as a Black woman, as a Black faculty member, then you have no idea of the fear that goes along with that, just being on this campus. So take those blinders off. See me, engage with me. I heard one of the speakers today say that people are ignorant about who I am. Talk to me, understand when I put my hand here, I can't hold your hand because then I have to go through my rituals to cleanse myself again so that I can pray. Hear that, engage with me, listen to me. Listen to me without engaging in microaggressions. Don't invalidate my experience. If I say I was walking across campus and someone spit on me, don't say, are you sure it's because you're Muslim? Maybe the wind blew the spit that way and they didn't mean to. I mean, you'll be surprised at what some of our people hear that invalidates their experience. And just so you know, if you're ever unclear about what to say, and you really don't know, because I really believe people invalidate because it's uncomfortable. If I ever tell you something that happened to me because of race or because of gender, the answer, if you don't know what to say, is to say, I'm so sorry you experienced that. That helps. At least it doesn't invalidate my experience. Listen to me, and more than anything, get to know me. Get to know me and who I am and how unique I am. You heard earlier today that people said, I am not representing the entire Muslim community. I don't represent every black woman. Every one of our experiences are not the same. They can be different and they can be unique. So listen to me and get to know me. Often I laugh because I hate fried chicken. And you know the stereotype about black people and fried chicken. And it's hilarious because when I used to go to white friends' houses, they would cook me fried chicken. And I had this dilemma, how do I tell them that? But when you have a relationship with people, relationships tear down stereotypes because you get to know people. So listen to me, see me, engage with me, and know me. Because there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we do not live single issue lives. And it's not a contest to determine who's more oppressed or which category is more oppressed. Oppression is oppression. It's very common for people to be privileged in some areas and oppressed in others. I enjoy religious privilege. When people say Happy Easter to me, I can say Happy Easter to you. I can't imagine what it's like to live in this society that's driven by Christian values and not see yourself reflected or represented, but not only that, having everything else imposed on you all the time. This is so powerful to me as I was thinking about this last week. There are as many expressions of bias as there are of oppression. And this is something we don't often think about. But let's talk about implicit bias and what that is. And it's these attitudes that are formed just from our everyday exposures. They come from a variety of sources. Earlier today, someone talked about the media and the way that it portrays certain groups of people so that you fear them or you hate them. It comes from newspapers, social medias, conversations with people we trust, the way that we were raised, and it depicts those we considered others in a negative light. And typically, these are people who are not within our own group, although it can exist within groups as well. And a lot of researchers believe that implicit bias is fueled by these symbolic attitudes, and it's something we actually develop over the course of our lives. And I like to think of it as an inner recording. So you see something, it's recorded. You experience something, it's recorded. You watch the news and it's recorded, and it's recorded, and it's recorded. And many of us are totally unaware of those recordings that we have that have developed over our lifetime. I'll give you an example. I grew up in Los Angeles in a predominantly black environment, went to predominantly black schools, where the students were black, the teachers were white. But anyway, I have a story. I got in trouble a lot, got suspended a lot, got kicked out of 3 schools. And I decided that I wanted to change my life, that I didn't want to go to schools where people expected the worst of me. And I asked my family if I could go to school out of district. And they let me go. My grandmother set me down because the school out of district was predominantly white. And my grandmother set me down, and she goes, "Baby, you're about to go to school with them white folks. And you're gonna have to work twice as hard to get half as far. And them white folks are really smart, really, really, really smart. So you're gonna have to work extra hard, and I know you can do it." Okay. And I went to school, and I found out the kids were no smarter than I was, and some of them not as much. But I never thought about that anymore. Never thought about that conversation. I went and I started out teaching at CCD, where I had very diverse students. And my very first day teaching at Metro, I walked into a classroom, and all my students were white. I could not believe what popped into my head. My grandmother's voice. "Baby, these white people are smart." And my next emotion was fear. Oh my gosh, they're all smart. I'm really gonna have to be on top of my game. Is that amazing? But that's what happens when things are recorded on your inner recording. How many of you remember Dan Issel? Anybody remember that name, Dan Issel? He used to be the coach of the Nuggets. And the Nuggets were losing big time. And you know, Colorado fans are fair weather fans, love you when you're winning, not so much when you're not. And Dan Issel was losing, and so he wasn't loved. And all of a sudden, people were talking about him, and they were playing a game and losing, and it was halftime. And Dan Issel was walking through the tunnel, dejected, losing, and people were calling him names and throwing things at him. And all of a sudden, I believe a cup hit him on the head. And he looked up and he said, "Shut up, you dirty Mexican." And that was the last we heard of Dan Issel. We never heard from him again. I don't know where he is. But do I believe Dan Issel is a racist? I don't know. But what I do know is that something was recorded on his inner recording that he may not have been aware of. And it came out in those times, in that time of stress. Implicit biases are biases that are especially intriguing because it gets us to act outside of the norm, outside of our norm, of the way that we think we are. What happens is that even the most well-intentioned person, they give in to these unconscious thoughts and feelings, and they're contrary to who we believe we are. It causes us to act at odds with our intentions. And it influences people not overtly, but very, very subtly. My husband grew up in the segregated South. And we were in my neighborhood, and my son was sledding. You know, he sled down, walk up. And I usually didn't go because I'm a California girl and it was much too cold for me. So I went this time because my son wanted me to. And I'm there and I'm watching this dynamic between my husband and my son. And it was the oddest thing because my son would slide down and he'd walk up. But on his way up, my husband would say, "Clarence, watch out. Clarence, move over. Clarence, stop. Clarence, be careful." And it was something about that that was uncomfortable for me. And after about the third time he was coming up, I'm thinking, why does he keep calling our son? So finally I said, "Honey, I need you to stop doing that." "Stop doing what?" "Stop calling his name so much." "Well, I don't want him to get hurt." I said, "But do you see anybody else out here calling their children?" Now, my son was the only African-American child sledding that day. So I'm wondering, why did that bother me so much? And I talked to my husband about it, and long story short, growing up in the segregated South, my husband was taught to move out of the way for white people. When he walked down the street, if white people walked toward him, he had to get off the curb. And my husband unknowingly was teaching our son, who was about 4 years old at the time, that you get out of the way for white people. And we had to talk about that. And it took him a few days to process it and realize that's what he was doing. And that's how these unconscious biases work. How could this play out with us? We can fight against sexism, but be real silent against racism. Notice that amazing women's march recently across the country and how few people of color you saw. We can fight homophobia, but avoid protecting our transgender population. We might stand up for racism, but not sexism. We might fight ageism, but we're silent on body shaming. We might stand up for women in domestic violence situations, but not for children who are spanked by their parents. And I know that's a controversial topic. Just sit with that one for a moment and think about it. Implicit association and biases are the messages that we receive throughout our lifetimes that play a role in how we see the world. And this is where our biases live. Every single person in this room has biases. Every one of us are biased, and that's not something we like to face. The greatest shame that I faced recently in my adult life was one of the biases that popped up when I was in Washington, D.C. lately. My son goes to Howard University, and he wanted to move off campus. And we found him a little brownstone not far from campus. And those of you who are familiar with Washington, D.C., you know the area around Howard used to be a very dangerous area, perceived that way. But through gentrification, it's changed. That's a conversation for another day. But I decided that I would, when I came to Howard the next week or two, that I would go by and look at the facility. I look at his apartment. I'm driving, I put everything on my GPS, and I'm driving, and I pull up, and right next to his brownstone is a black man. Big black guy, dark, white t-shirt on and jeans. I pull up, I see him, and to my shame and horror, the first thing I thought, my first thought was, oh no, he's not moving here, it's dangerous. My second thought is, I hope the housing office is open so I can go get his dorm room back. I was so ashamed of myself, and because I've been doing this work so long, it compounded it. And I'm sitting there thinking, what? I caught it immediately. I put my hands on the steering wheel, put my head there, and I thought, how did this happen to me? That man looked like my husband. It could be my brother, my uncle, my father, my son. But yet my brain went there. And I had my head on the steering wheel, beating myself up, wondering how this could happen to me. And I've been doing this work for years. And then it occurred to me I've been sitting there too long. Because now the guy is like, what's up? And I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, okay, what am I going to do now? And I did what I encourage everybody to do, is to face it. Face it. I got out of the car and I said, hey, and I had to have a reason for sitting, right? I said, hey, how you doing? And I said, I'm looking for this address. And he goes, oh, it's right here. I said, thank you. I get lost so much. It's so frustrating for me. I thought I was lost. Little fib. I thought I was lost, but thank you so much. I'm here. It's right here. He goes, yeah, it's right here. And I said, oh, you know, my son, he's a student at Howard. He's going to be living here. Are you a student at Howard too? He goes, not really. I'm a resident. I go to their law school. I go to their medical school. Oh, nice to meet you. All right. And I share that because first the shame, and if I can own it with my own people, I hope that it inspires you to own your stuff. We got to own this stuff and say it exists. Some of you, when I read the slide about the minister who's trans, for some of you who may be Christians, that may not have sat well with you. Feel it. Feel uncomfortable and face it. And I share that the guy is a doctor just because he was, but he could have been the janitor, he could have been homeless, no matter who or what he was, he did not deserve to be stereotyped and feared simply because of who he was. We all have biases, we all have to own it. Now, when people feel fear, threat, or anxiety, the amygdala, that part of the brain is activated. Studies show that people who have arachnophobia, fear of spiders, when they see pictures like that, they feel it. I feel it. You see, I'm not looking at my computer or the screen. Anybody else feel it? Who are afraid of spiders? You look at that, and what it shows is that there's more activity in the brain because of the fear. Unfortunately, when this study was conducted, when whites were shown faces of black men, that part of the brain was activated as well. When we have fear, this is what happens. Men hate each other because they fear each other. And they fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they are often separated from each other. So what I want you to do as I close is make a personal commitment to address your bias. Acknowledge the potential for implicit bias to impact your decisions, how you see your students, how you see your colleagues, how you see people in the world, and avoid stereotyping. Notice diversity fatigue. Notice how you respond when this comes up. Notice the if you're tired of hearing it, imagine those of us who are tired of living it. It shows up in your body language, your inactivity, and your intolerance for conversations. All oppression is connected. And remember, just being aware of it, being aware of your biases, aware is halfway there. Thank you very much.